Let's get started with Mast. So first of all, we assume you found the landing page here. And to start, if you aren't familiar with what a CSS framework is outside of Webflow, frameworks in Webflow, or even just what Mast is compared to some of the other options in the space, definitely check out this What is Mast video. It will go over all those details and more. From there, once you're ready to build, let's go click and open the docs and clone the style guide. So the docs is the source of truth of all knowledge about Mast, right? This is the why, the what, the how, workflow of all the details you need to know about building with Mast. A lot of this you don't necessarily need to know out the gate before you start anything, but you should definitely cover some key points that we will in this video. The clonable is simply the starter project on how you get started with Mast, right? So you would go clone this project. If you aren't familiar with this workflow in the Webflow space, this is equivalent to, pulling in a CSS file, like Bootstrap, Tailwind, whatever, if you're more of a developer, into your code project, right? But instead, we start with this baseline project that has all the elements, styles, components, variables, etc., predefined in this strategic system. So with that created, let's hop back over to the docs and go to the getting started section. It will note how to do what we just did, right? Go clone the style guide, add some fonts, and so on. It will go on to the customizing Mast section where it'll talking about all the things you need to update, specifically all the variables, classes, components, etc. And then we also note this section about designing for Mast. There is a pre-built Figma file here that you can get from the community. And this file really is a high level overview that is intended to be a baseline starting point. It is by no means thorough, and we just want to cover some of the core things that are valuable with it. One being variables. So this has all the same variable collections and variables set up as the Webflow clonable. So you can see if I go back over to Webflow, you can see all those same collections there that we have right here. And if I go into any, you can see theme open there, it's all the same variables with one very key difference. In Figma, we cannot define and design with units that are proper web units like rems, ems, vws, whatever. Instead, we can only use pixels. And so all the values, therefore, in here are set as pixels. And over in Webflow, we are going to use the proper web values. So one key area, for example, is if I go back to Figma, sorry to jump back and forth, is you can see we have two modes, desktop and mobile, or max and min. So these are intended to directly correspond to the max and min font size values that in this case are set in rems, right? So it's this value divided by 16 is going to match your rem value here. And Mast makes it really easy to just set these values as well as other ones directly. You should almost never have to directly manipulate things like clamp calculations that are actually handling the fluid responsive type in Mast. And so that's one key point. The other key point is really the 12 column guides that are preset in here. Pretty basic, and you can obviously customize those. But these are really key to design around just because it will make it the easiest to translate the design into the grid layout system over in Mast that uses the same idea of 12 columns, rows and columns, set different sizes, alignments, so on and so forth. By no means can you only design within those 12 columns. Go nuts. You can do anything custom, of course. It's just a really good general rule of thumb. So if we go back and assume that we have all of our variables set and everything's ready to go, and we want to go ahead and start moving some of those styles over, while there is things like the Figma to Webflow plugin that can help with some of this, really at this moment in time, it's easiest to just go one by one, take this initial time to set things up. And then in the future, we may also have more power with things like the Webflow Designer MCP that came out recently, and so we can maybe have AI help us do some of this. So really the workflow would be, as we said earlier, add your custom fonts to the project, and then I would usually start from the color collection and then add in any of the high-level colors that you need to add, and then go associate those to the themes. By no means do you have to have 4 different modes here. We're just showing the context of how you can use these. Some projects, for example, that just have light and dark mode will delete these 2 and just keep these 2. Some might only have 1 mode and they don't really care about other variants, but this is up to you in your project and how do you want to control it. And then from there, Typography, go through each of the heading levels, update the font sizes, weights, line heights, all that. If you need to create other typesets, you can do that. Just follow the same structure and pattern and nomenclature as is already in here. And so you can infinitely scale this to as many different typesets as you need. Components, these are the high level values for things like spacing, border radius, etc. around components, but there's a key point we want to make here, that you can scroll through and see what's here, setting your, container max width, section padding, card padding and radius, button, styling and spacing. But especially with things like button and input, you'll notice that there's no association with color or anything like that in the variables, because we believe that things like buttons and inputs can be so vastly different from one project to another that it's a lot better to instead just keep those high level values controlled from variables that we know almost every button has, right? Every button's going to have some kind of padding, or not. But then once you want to style further, you want to add shadows and gradients and effects, that's where we want to lean back into the visual editing power of Webflow and just simply go edit the component. You'll see that there's a button class in this example on here. And so we can go ahead and add shadows and gradients and whatever other things we need here that specifically match our design system without having to fiddle with those in variables alone. Or maybe in some cases where our project is very simple, we don't want to have way too many variables built out in our project that can ultimately slow it down or make it more confusing for others to onboard onto if we don't really need those globally. From there, once you've updated all your core components and styles, let's go back to the docs and kind of go through some of the key points to cover here, and then you'll be off to the races. First point is fundamentals. I'm a big believer in the why behind anything. I love understanding the world through metaphors, and specifically around Mast, the metaphor that if you give somebody a fish, they'll eat for a day. If you teach them to fish, they will eat for a lifetime. And we genuinely hope that Mast will be a framework that teaches you to fish in a metaphorical sense. In other words, we want this to be the baseline foundation. The 80% of any project can be built with these classes and components and elements and styles, but you're always going to have that extra 20% that's completely bespoke. You're always going to customize things, extend things, add more utility classes, more components for each individual project, and we want that to remain as lightweight as possible so that you can use Mast, whether it's a single simple landing page all the way up to a massive enterprise site like webflow.com is now built on Mast. So that is a key point to get. Sometimes we get people that try Mast and they're like, well, I want all these different flex utilities or all these other ones. It's like, great, add those. We don't believe that those are necessary for every single project at this point. We're always evolving things, of course, so we want your feedback. Please let us know. But we really always prioritize keeping things as lightweight and simple as possible and reused as possible. And that point goes into these other two here. Keep it dry is a high level CSS one, although this mentality flows straight through to how we use components in Mast as well. We want to reuse them as often as possible to keep the project as lightweight as possible. And reduce cognitive load also goes into this idea of reusability, where we want to reuse concepts in Mast. Like a key one that we'll show in a moment is how you control common layouts with rows and columns, and using that exact same approach when you're building with static divs and classes, as well as when you're building with components, or more like when your marketer, collaborator, client is using components in build mode to build with the same consistent mentality. Beyond that, check out other things like already styled, and then we get into things like nomenclature. How do we name classes? Some of this is a bit more in the weeds. You don't necessarily need to grasp this at the start, but know where these sections are so that as you start building and you see the way a class is named or how something is built in the clonable, come back here and reference that. Moving on, we can go into other areas of the docs, like class management, and this lower section is all really shaped around best practices, how we handle variable collections and naming, interactions, CSS, custom code, etc. These are all, again, very valuable things to know, but not necessarily something you have to cover out the gate. And then as we move into the styles section, the styles and components section directly correlate to the styles and components pages in the clonable project. So you can see I can open up the page panel here, see that we have styles, and it goes by typography, color, modes, utilities, etc. We're going to have the same thing here: typography, color, utilities, layout, etc. And then moving into the components, you can see we can go over there and see all of our components. Anything from basic inputs and buttons to accordions, modals, sliders, inline video, and so on. And so all those details are outlined here. Again, a lot of these things, if you're building websites at all, are probably high-level, common things you're expecting anyway, so you don't necessarily need to read every nit and grit detail here, but we outline all the classes that are used, a lot of key details, and my main point here is always that you may not need an accordion, but when you do, it might be helpful to come read some of these points the first time to understand why it's built the way it is, how it's built, some of the things to know along the way. Lastly, in the docs, if you're ever curious and you use one version of Mast and then later you come back and something's changed, we have a change log. We try to keep track of all the things that do change at a high level. We by no means are going to be granular on every individual small little change, but the high level things are here to note, and I would always use the latest version of Mast at any point into the future. So from there, the one other thing I want to cover in a bit more depth is the layout system in Mast, as what I believe is a bit more of a differentiator, especially in the Webflow space, and also a really tried and true scalable system that came, from inspiration even beyond myself or Mast. Really, this is a beyond the high level page structure, which is pretty straightforward. What I want to get into is the grid system here, which is a row and column based system. It's very similar to Bootstrap, if you're familiar, that's been around in the development space for a very long time. And I've used it across hundreds of projects and really find it valuable and an essential thing to learn, not just for you as a developer, because it is reused in so many ways across how you build with Mast, but also is this fundamental concept that you can later teach to marketer, client, collaborator that'll be using build mode and using this exact same concept with components, right? So the general point is we have rows and columns, right? A row wraps one or multiple columns. Any column can be set to 1 to 12 columns width at each individual breakpoint. You can skip a breakpoint. So for example, you could define, I want a 6 out of 12 or a half width column at desktop, and then just add one more class to say, now I want this to be full width at mobile landscape, and that's it. Or you can find it at each breakpoint as you need. Then up on the row level, we can use additional classes on top of row to control alignment and justification of the columns within it. We can also offset columns, reorder columns, adjust the gap at the row level that is set between the columns, and so on. And so let's go look at this in practice. The first place I'd start showing how this works with basic divs and classes is directly in the clonable itself. Everything in this clonable is built with Mast itself. So anytime we have people ask, well, I want to see a project built in it, one of the best sources of truth is always going to be the clonable itself, including some of the example layouts we'll show here in a moment. And so if we look at any situation here where you can see rows and columns and click into it, then you can see here we have a simple div with the class of row, and then in it we have a div with the class of call, and then as I just said in the example, we have call-lg, so desktop at 6, and then we skip MD for tablet and go straight to SM for mobile landscape and say then we want it to be 12. So you can see it's half width here. If I even duplicate this column, that might help illustrate it, stays half width there, and then they stack vertically to 12 on mobile landscape, as we'd expect. If I remove something here and then go up to the row level, this is again where I can set some different alignment and justification, as I noted. And so you can simply tack these things on. And what's so powerful about it is that you can control each column individually, which in some rights might feel like a little bit of extra work, but it ultimately leads to a lot more flexibility in the long run. You can also use it for other things like centering, right? I can also justify this and center columns very easily, something you can't do as easily with something like CSS Grid. Although CSS Grid is great, and I absolutely would still recommend it, recommend using it when you need to for specific custom layouts and custom components. But overall, again, in that 80-20 mentality that you saw in the fundamentals of Mast, we really believe that this system solves for that well. So this is how you build with it with static elements and classes. Let's go over to the basic layout or inspired layouts pages to see how this same system is used with components. Ultimately, we recommend that Mast is a component first tool. In other words, we recommend that you build as many layouts and pages as possible entirely with components. And so you'll see that if you open up the navigator for either of the basic layouts or the inspired layouts page, they're built entirely with components. And you can still have quite a lot of flexibility in layout, right? And so if I go look at any row and columns here, you'll see that we have the same exact structure, right? We have a row, and then in it we have columns, and then in those columns we have all the content that we need. And then one key point here as well is where this gets really powerful is nesting rows and columns and getting creative with how you combine these things to create layouts that you wouldn't otherwise probably expect from such a simple concept as rows and columns. And so we use this whenever we can, including something like this, right? We have two buttons next to each other. We don't, to the point of reusability, we don't recommend having a niche component for every little common thing that you might need, like some other frameworks might use a button wrapper here. That's one more thing for yourself and the client or collaborator to learn. Instead, what if we reuse the row and column system here, just like anywhere else, so we can have the same level of control and functionality around it. And so we do that here. We have a row and then two columns within it, and those columns are just simply set to shrink, so they just take up the size of the button within them. So this can get started, and you can see it just grows with it. And then similarly, we can control alignment and all that. And then the one key we'll note here once we get into components, and this is one other high level point with Mast, is that the way that Mast is designed to be used with build mode is to abstract away the need for classes. So you'll see in the vast majority of these layouts, if we click around, you can see all of our props over here on the right, and we have things like class, style, etc. in an advanced group on purpose, because we believe that really the marketer, collaborator, the non-technical user of the project shouldn't even need to see that. They should only be able to click, edit, copy, paste, select an element or a component, and then adjust some basic settings without ever having to understand the concept of classes, or especially use them in a functional way, like adding multiple to define some kind of styling, right? And so in some cases, though, we do still want the option to use classes as a fallback for edge cases. So you can see for things like this, where we have a row, we're then using the row gap button class to adjust that gap to a specific gap for buttons, so that way that gap is adjusted if you have primary, secondary, or you can adjust it further if you have a text style button, for example. And so we only ever want to use those in those cases, and the idea is that the marketer, client, collaborator can simply copy paste instances of this to places that they need it without necessarily needing to know what and how to add things. This is also really good to show if we go over to the inspired layouts page, because this, as the name implies, is all sections built with the exact same components, rows, columns, etc. But as we scroll through, you can see the layouts are a lot more divergent from the common text on the left, image on the right. We're showing how to do things like full background images, split apart layouts with things like MT auto, right? And so again, you can see cases like this where we're only using these class modifiers just to adjust something, where like if a client collaborator didn't add those, they could still have a layout that is technically successful and responsive. That is another point to make here, is that all of the row and column system with components is responsive by default, where it is not when you're using the classes, right? When you're using the classes and divs, you need to define when you want things to shift. But with rows and columns and components, we don't want our marketers and collaborators to have to understand even the idea and learn the idea of responsiveness and all of that. So instead, we make a lot of assumptions, right? So depending on the size of column set, things will shift at tablet to be half width, and then stack on mobile landscape for almost any other size. Or if they are a larger column width, they'll just start stacking on tablet. And so you can see that working here. One other great example of how all these things interwork together and how the system is consistent from static development to component development is that you can also layer in more specificity of column control if you really want to. So in this case, for example, if I wanted this text to be on top, you can see I can use the call SM first utility class on this column, and it will do just that. At SM, or mobile landscape, it will bring this column to the top or to be first, right? So very, very useful to intermix here. Another example here is, for example, if you went down to tablet and you wanted this to stay smaller, I could simply say call MD4 here, right? And you can use those exact same classes directly with components. And then when we get here, we want that to go big again, so we'll go back to SM12. So overall, very, very powerful and flexible system. Again, we've used it at scale across many, many sites to know its power and are excited to keep evolving it. I hope this helps. Thank you for sticking around this long if you had. And I hope this helps you get going with building with Mast. And please, as always, let us know any feedback along the way. You can always cast feedback if you go to back to the landing page here. You can either hit the submit button here and that will take you to the same place, or down here at the bottom of the Mast landing page, there is a share some feedback. Hit send feedback. This will take you to that same form where you can do general feedback and send us a message. Thank you so much for your time. Happy building with Mast.